If you have been around the rail fanning community, you probably have heard about Richard Jensen and 5629's story. And yes, I know, many people have done videos on him and the locomotives he was involved in, but nobody has made one singular video about the entire story. And some locomotives have gotten more attention than others, so that's what I did. I hope you enjoy it. Richard Hans Carl Jensen was born on June 30th, 1931. By the 1950s, he was traveling around the United States and Canada filming the last days of steam on North America. While doing that, he noticed how tickets for these steam excursions were bringing in lots of money. He thought having his own steam locomotive and running excursions could help him get extra money and expand his hobby. So he began saving up money from his job, which was delivering bread. In March of 1960, he bought Grand Trunk Western 5629 for approximately $9,540. Grand Trunk Western 5629 was the third locomotive of the K4A class of Pacifics built by the American Locomotive Company in 1924. It would serve for 35 years until being retired in 1959. On September 27, 1959, 5629 pulled an excursion for the Michigan Railroad Club from Detroit to Bay City. Jensen was on board that trip and bought the locomotive in March of 1960, roughly 6 months later. 5629 was moved to a siding in Hammond, Indiana, that was owned by the Baltimore and Ohio. He got 5629 running in just over a year. In mid 1961, Jensen was interviewed by the Chicago Tribune. He told them that he was working up to 50 hours a week on the locomotive. One night he fell asleep working on the locomotive. He woke up at 3:30 a.m. underneath the locomotive and went home to only get 3 hours of sleep and continue work on the locomotive the next day. The first excursion under Jensen's ownership was on November 5th, 1961, over the Baltimore and Ohio's Chicago Terminal Railroad. During this time, 5629 was lettered for the Baltimore and Ohio. 5629 was stored at the Baltimore and Ohio Hammond Roundhouse until Jensen could find a more suitable location. In 1964, Jensen moved 5629 to the Chicago and Western Indiana's 49th Street Roundhouse in Chicago. Jensen became a regular customer at scrap dealers around Chicago. He would walk around the yards with a soapstone chalking "Save RJ" on anything he wanted. Soon he had several freight cars and a baggage car of parts. A few people said his house was full of locomotive parts. During a rail fanning trip to Kentucky in early 1965, Jensen found and later purchased Georgia and Northern 102, a 460 built by Elco in 1923. It was shipped to Chicago on a flat car and sat in a yard for 26 years. Later that year, a friend of Jensen's who owned a scrapyard asked for his assistance moving some equipment. As a thank you, Nickel Plate Road 965 was offered to Jensen. A miscommunication between the scrapyard owner and his employees resulted in 965 being scrapped before Jensen could save it. After failing to acquire a 482 from the Frisco, Jensen went to the CB&Q in 1966 and acquired 5632, a 05B Class 484, and 4963 in 01A Class 282. 5632 was in the middle of a rebuild when Jensen purchased it, and 4963 was being used as a parts engine. Jensen intended to return both locomotives to steam. Both locomotives and some boxcars were moved to the CW&I Roundhouse. 5632 was built by the CB&Q shops in 1940 and pulled mainline freight and passenger trains until being used in the steam program. Starting in 1959, 5632 would pull excursions for the CB&Q alongside 4960 and 6315. For two specific excursions, 5632 was painted gold. After the 1964 season, 5632's flue time was up and it entered an overhaul which was still ongoing when Jensen bought 5632. CB&Q 4963 was built in 1923 by Baldwin and was used for mainline freight trains until being leased to the Bevier and Southern Railroad to haul short-distance freight trains in the early 1960s. It was subsequently retained by the CB&Q and used as a source of spare parts before being acquired by Jensen. Back to 5629. In 1966, Jensen purchased a tender from a Sioux Line 482 to use on longer excursions with 5629. 5629's original tender was placed on a spur at the CW&I Roundhouse. It is unknown what happened to it, though it was most likely scrapped. The first long distance trip happened in May 1966 over former Nickel Plate Road trackage from Indianapolis to Noblesville, Indiana. During one of the trips, 5629's injector malfunctioned and the fire was dropped on a siding. Diesels were used for the remaining trip. 5629 was towed dead to Indianapolis. 5629 was operational the following day. Following that trip, 5629 traveled light engine to Decatur, Illinois for a proposed excursion. For unknown reasons, that trip was canceled and 5629 returned to Chicago. The next excursions of the 1966 season were on Grand Trunk Western trackage alongside Reading 2102. In 1967 and 1968, 5629 was used to pull the Schlitz circus train. In 1968, Graham Claytor traveled to Chicago in hopes to purchase 5629 and use it for Southern Railway excursions. Jensen arrived at the meeting covered in grease and soot from working on 5629. Jensen declined the Southern Railway's offer, believing 5629 was worth a lot more money. In 1968, ownership of the CW&I had changed. The new owners wanted to demolish the roundhouse on 49th Street. With no warning, on February 27, 1969, Jensen was given a notice that he had 30 days to vacate the property. He negotiated and had the deadline moved to June 1st. Lots of smaller items were loaded into Jensen's bread delivery truck and stored at his home in Forest Park, Illinois. Jensen and his crew searched for a place to store 4963 and 5632. At one point, there were discussions of bringing the locomotives to the Illinois Railway Museum, but that never happened. 5629 was in storage at Detroit at the time and could not be used to move his equipment. On September 25, 1969, 5632 and 4963 and the freight cars filled with the parts were illegally sold to the Erman Howell scrapyard for $5,800. Jensen tried to buy his locomotives back for the same price, but his offer was rejected. During November of 1972, 5632 was relocated in the yard and derailed on a switch. It was scrapped in place. After finding out what happened to 5632, Jensen sued the CW&I and Erman Howell in early 1973. One of the court sessions involved Erman Howell bringing in all of the parts stored in the boxcars for the jury to view. This included a side rod from Georgia and Northern 102. After years of negotiations, the scrapyard was supposed to give Jensen $1.7 million. For some reason, he never got the full amount. In 1970, he purchased another locomotive, York Southern Number 1. It was a 460 built by Baldwin in 1916. After serving several railroads, it was purchased by Byron Andrews in the late 60s for use on a proposed tourist railroad. It was sold to a scrapper in a sheriff auction as Byron failed to pay rent for the storage site. Jensen bought it from the scrapper and moved it to the Chicago West Pullman and Southern Railroad yard. In April of 1971, another trip over Penn Central was planned for 5629, but was canceled as there were problems getting coaches for the event. He was also in financial issues following the legal battles, so many people who bought tickets for the Penn Central trip would never get their money back. In the early 1970s, there were many other locomotives pulling excursions, and it was hard for Jensen to keep up. In addition, railroads were making it harder to run excursions over their track. 5629 ran its final excursion in spring of 1973. In 1975, Jensen was hired to go to Fort Worth, Texas to restore Texas and Pacific 610 for use on the American Freedom Train. The project fell behind schedule and he was fired from the project. A couple years after returning to Chicago, he slipped and fell down a flight of stairs helping a friend move a new fridge. He was hospitalized for a few weeks. He fell into more financial trouble and was failing to pay rent where he stored his equipment. At the time, 5629 was being stored at the Penn Central Amtrak yard near Chicago's Union Station. He was also behind on rent there, so he began searching for new places to store 5629. He went to many railroads, said no. He went to the Chicago South Shore and South Bend's offices and was almost thrown off the property for demanding they store 5629. He was able to store 5629 at Rock Island's Roundhouse in Blue Island, Illinois. Around 1979, Rock Island asked Jensen to move 5629 out of the roundhouse as they were going to demolish it. 5629 was moved to the Blue Island yard. It would never move again. In 1981, the Chicago West Pullman and Southern gave up trying to collect rent. They sold York Southern 1 and 2 Illinois Central tenders that were originally from 2482s to William Latham. Latham planned to create a small railroad museum. When his plan fell through, though, he donated number 1 to the Monticello Railroad Museum. The two tenders were scrapped. The Rock Island entered bankruptcy in 1980. The Blue Island property was sold to Metra, who wanted to build a shop complex there. Metra asked Jensen to move 5629, but when he was preparing to move it, he realized that Metra employees had removed critical moving parts. Around this time, Jensen decided if he didn't move 5629 and Metra scrapped it, he could file another lawsuit. The track in 5629 had also been removed, making the only way to remove it by truck. That was something Jensen couldn't afford. He even started removing parts from the locomotive and sold them to rail fans. In May of 1987, the IRM offered Jensen $15,000 to remove the locomotive. He declined. The Mid-Continent Railway Museum made a similar offer and was declined. Metro went to the court requesting permission to seize 5629 and donate it, but the court refused. By June, Jensen was banned from entering the yard as Metro feared 5629 had become a safety hazard from all of the parts he removed. On July 1st, 1987, Metro received a court order to scrap 5629. Jensen tried to appeal, but was denied. Metra contacted Erman Howell to dispose of 5629. On July 14th, the scrapping began. After 5629 was scrapped, Jensen filed a lawsuit. This time the court did not rule in his favor. He died on March 16, 1991. Shortly after his death, a member of the IRM found Georgia and Northern 102 sitting on a flat car in Chicago. A scrapper with a torch was approaching the locomotive. The member stopped him, insisting he wait to let the IRM see it. The IRM paid the $50,000 owed to the railroad storing it, and Jensen's sister donated it to the IRM. The IRM would eventually sell it to a park in Curry, Minnesota. In 1991, 4963 had still been sitting in the scrapyard where it was placed in 1969. The IRM, fearing another one of Jensen's locomotives getting scrapped, they traded 5 former Grand Trunk Western 080s that they acquired from the Northwestern Steel and Wire for 4963. Don't worry, there are a few other Grand Trunk Western 080s still around. 4963 currently sits in Barn 9 at the IRM and has been cosmetically restored. Well, that's the story. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. I am planning on making some videos on more obscure steam locomotives in the future, more specifically the Kansas City Southern's articulateds. I hope you enjoyed the video.